Good evening. My name is David Greenwald. You are watching Vanguard Court Watch Live, and we are doing our second segment on Ajay Dev's case. If you're just joining us, Ajay was convicted of rape back in 2009, and he was sentenced to 378 years in prison. This summer, at some point in time, we will have an evidentiary hearing here in Yolo County where Ajay Dev could be exonerated depending on what a judge rules. We have, over the last several months, been reviewing the case of Ajay Dev, and several of our interns have been reading the 20 volumes of trial transcript from his 2009 trial. So we'll start here with Lauren. Tell us what witnesses you read and kind of your impression.
Okay, so I read a variety of witnesses. One was the across the street neighbor of the Devs, and she basically said that they seemed like a normal family, and she talked a lot about knowing them for 7 years, and that like everything was pretty much normal with them. Like she came over to their house twice, just like to socialize. And they would talk like when they were in their front yards a lot, and and then I got Ajay's brother, who had a lot of information, of course, and so he talked about how they had all immigrated from Nepal and what years they had immigrated, and talked about how there was like a fight between Ajay and his wife and the alleged victim, and the brother who was testifying, and their parents, and how they had 4 years where they didn't really speak except for a holiday called Tika, which he compared to Christmas. And he said during that 4 years, besides that, he only saw his brother and the family a few days before his wedding, and then the day of his wedding they were there. I have a whole lot. And okay, I have no idea what is important and what is not important.
Okay, well we'll come back to you in a minute. Kelsey, who did you read testimony?
Yeah, I read 4 different witness testimonies, and all of them were called by the defense, so that was an interesting angle to come at it at.
I'm sorry, all of them were?
Called by the defense.
Oh, called by the defense.
And the first witness I read, she was a family friend of the Devs. She had known them for 15 years, and she had stayed over at their house multiple times. They had stayed over at her house. So she felt she was very close to them, and she basically served, I think, as a character witness. She talked a lot about Ajay Dev's character and how he was a very kind man. He was known to be very respectful of women, and he was very close to his adopted daughter, the alleged victim. And yeah, she basically spoke a lot to their relationship and how comfortable that the alleged victim seemed to feel around him, and how everything seemed very normal in the household. The second witness I read was a psychiatrist. He actually was submitted as an expert witness in the field of sexual assault, and he talked a lot about basically what happens after a child is sexually assaulted, and the most common outcome is PTSD. And it was interesting that the defense wanted him to denounce this theory called child sexual assault accommodation syndrome, which I believe that the prosecution had used at some earlier point. He was talking about the fact that it was seen as a clinical opinion and not an actual thing, and I think the child sexual assault accommodation syndrome, sorry, that's a very long name. It's basically when the child is sworn into secrecy, and that's why they may not come out for a while and talk about the sexual assault. And he said that is sometimes the case, but it's not always the case. And I think the defense was coming at the angle that the reason the alleged victim did not come out for quite some time is because of that, but he basically denounced it in his testimony. The third witness I read was a lawyer who was basically talking about immigration status and what was going on with the alleged victim. His was just very matter-of-fact testimony, just talking about how the Dev family had got in contact with him and said that they were willing to testify against the alleged victim in court. And it was just basically him going over some emails he had read. He had corresponded with the Devs over. And the last witness I read was another expert witness in the field of looking at the computers and talking about some pornography found on the computer. And he was talking about where that could have originated from. And I think the prosecution at some point earlier had talked about how it was probably coming from Ajay Dev viewing the porn, but he actually testified that it could have been to some file sharing application that had caused what is called a porn storm. And it was a very technical testimony. So that was the main point of it. Yeah.
Okay. Penelope?
Well, I viewed a variety of witnesses, mostly from the family. I also saw an expert witness who was actually talking about the CARE, which is spelled C-A-A-R-E. And this expert witness, he contradicted himself in his testimony. I also had the neighbor and an old coworker, and they all touched upon similar events, such as like the Caribbean trip, the Christmas, an argument with about the phone card. I believe that the alleged victim had costed the Devs $500 worth of bills, and there was an argument about that. But all of my witnesses all talked about how the alleged victim was lied, and how affectionate she was with her adoptive parents, and and all of them seemed to stated, besides the expert witness, that they appeared to have a normal family.
Okay. So let's start with Penelope. So what's your overall impression of the testimony, at least the portion that you read?
It seems, based on what I've read, it seems that there are some inconsistencies. It seems that everyone has said the same thing, that the alleged victim was very loving, and it was coming from people that had a close relationship with her. The only witness that I came across that seemed to say that there might be a case is the expert witness, but he had no knowledge of the trial. These expert witnesses, they just go in and testify based on their own research, their own studies, and they have no knowledge of what actually happened.
Okay. Kelsey, your overall impression?
I do agree with the inconsistencies, because all the defense witnesses, in my opinion, had very strong testimonies, and they all seemed a little bit confused about like how this case came about, especially the first witness, who was the character witness, who had known the Devs for 15 years. She had said like she was very blindsided by this news. And then the others, the psychiatrist basically said that there was not really a case in his opinion because of what he has seen in the past of sexual assault. So I do believe that it does seem that there's something weird going on, and that really wasn't addressed in these testimonies.
Lauren?
Yeah, so what I gathered mostly so I heard his brother and also his wife testify, part of the testimony, and a few like people who were just in their social circles interacted with them normally, and nobody said anything that was abnormal. It was very clear that they had a strained relationship, and it kind of started going downhill, and so like for that reason I understand that she would have a motive, the alleged victim would have a motive to make the accusation that she did, because they did have a rocky relationship, but the rocky relationship was not what she accused Mr. Dev of. They seem to have fights like teenagers do. One time the mother said that she overreacted and slapped her, and that was the full extent of any violence that they talked about. So it seemed like a normal not happy teenage relationship, but not to the extent that she accused her adoptive father of.
Did you read the wife's testimony about where she went into specific incidents?
Yeah.
So what was your impression of that?
There were lots. So she talked about, she started, so I read only part of her testimony, starting with the $500 phone bill incident. So usually she would use calling cards because her biological father lived in Nepal. And this time, for some reason, on September 26th, 2002, she had an 80-minute conversation with her biological father over the landline, which they didn't find out about until they got a phone bill for more than $500. And they were like, why did you do this?
Ouch.
Why not use a calling card? Because, so her adoptive mother was saying that they encouraged her to contact her family in Nepal. They gave her calling cards. She would call them regularly like that. And like that was an established method once they had gotten settled into their home. And this was like out of character and not and uncalled for, really. For her to call on a landline, which she knew would cause a large bill. So they got into an argument about that. This was the time where her mother said, I overreacted and slapped her. They sent emails to her biological father asking just like for advice and what do we do? She's being difficult, basically. She's being a difficult teenager. And then she talked about the April incident, which is when the alleged victim didn't come home from work. She had a shift probably that ended around 10 or 11 p.m. and she didn't come home that night, and so they were worried, of course, that she wasn't home a few hours after her shift, and they asked the across the street neighbors, who I heard the lady from across the street testify. They told them to watch the house, and then they went around the town looking for her. The store was closed, so she wasn't at the store. She wouldn't pick up her phone, and then eventually she did pick up her phone and just said, "Oh, I'm at a friend's house and I'll be home by 2." And she talked about how college was going for her, that fall of 2003 she started her second year at Sacramento City College. She was really struggling academically. She had 2 classes that she was repeating already, and she failed both of the first midterms for those classes, so her mother was worried that she would be put on academic probation, and told her, you should withdraw from those classes and take other classes that you think you'll do better in. So she did that, but also they figured out that she had been, the night before one of the midterms, texting a boy until 1 a.m., and they were not happy about that because they assumed that led to her not doing well in the midterm so much as failing it, and also that she had been cutting class to go eat lunch and go out with this boy and his brother and another girl. And then she talked a bit about how the alleged victim moved out, how they had a discussion in late November about that if she wasn't going to live by the rules that they put forward, that she needed to move out, and she did move out on December 1st of 2003. So they had this discussion, they went to walk their dog, and then they came back to a note on the dining room table that said that she was done, she was leaving. So she moved out, and then a few days later they met up to deal with money because they had a joint bank account, and so the alleged victim and her adoptive mom talked at a coffee shop. They tried to. Her mom was saying that she tried to like make amends and at least get to like the point where she would she offered to help move her into her new apartment, help her pack her stuff that was at their house, and yeah. And then, last thing, so they said that on December 6th, which happened to be the anniversary of her adoption, was a day that they spent a lot of time helping her buy furniture and pack and move in, and it just happened to be right around that date. That was the end of her testimony.
Thank you. So let's start again with Penelope. So do you believe the witness, and if so, why? If not, why not?
Coming into this case, I was a little iffy because I wasn't sure. You guys all seemed convinced that he was innocent, but I still wasn't sure. And as I was reading all of my witnesses, it seemed like they were all kind of saying the same thing, that she was very spoiled. She threw temper tantrums, and then she'd be loving, and she just wanted things her way. And but they all mentioned that the Devs were strict parents, and I'm sure that, and I read about a lot of arguments, or sorry, I lost my train of thought.
You read about a lot of arguments.
They all mentioned similar arguments, like about the phone incident, about them going away, about Sapna's, about the alleged victim's birthday, about the will, and about family trips. They all are saying the same thing, and I don't think they would all come together to fabricate this story. There's too much specific details.
So tell us about the trips.
They were a family that valued being together and spending time together. They would go to Monterey, I believe, to visit the cousins. I think on the Mr. Dev's father-in-law's side, one of her cousins said that he loved spending time with her, and that he never questioned there was something going on the trip. I mean, they didn't see each other often, but when they did go down to Monterey, they would have a great time. One of the interesting witnesses that I saw, that I assume would have no reason to lie, was one of their neighbors, and he was asked to keep an eye on while the Devs were gone, and usually they kept their curtains open, but only when she would bring over boys without telling the parents, she would close the curtains. And he was actually fixing the pipes for the family, and he was underneath the house, and he heard them talking. And her adoptive mother asked her if she had any boys were home, and she said no. And he heard her lie, but he didn't want to get involved, so he didn't correct her. And I think that speaks a lot to her character, if someone who's completely separated from this close family to talk about an incident where she is shown to be not a liar, but deceptive.
So Kelsey, your thoughts?
I agree, definitely, especially the first witness who I read. Her testimony seemed very much in line with the narrative that the Devs presented, and it seemed like she would have no reason to lie. She was very consistent in her story. She didn't trip up. There were no inconsistencies. And the other witnesses I read were all removed from the case. There was the psychiatrist, the immigration lawyer, and the computer expert. And they all seemed to agree that there was really no evidence that the prosecution was going with other than the statement from the alleged victim.
Okay. One thing I'll mention is that, and we talked about this in the last segment, the computer evidence is actually critical here, because part of the prosecution's theory of the case is that he kind of used the pornography as a tool tool to kind of ply her up, or however you want to put it. And the jury actually acquitted him on the pornography charges. So they completely didn't buy into that, and yet they ended up convicting him anyway. But that computer expert who was able to kind of show that it was he probably didn't actually download porn was kind of critical to that case. So the jury ended up convicting him of 76 of 92 charges. Not that that makes a huge difference, but it definitely shows that there were some flaws in the prosecution's case. So, Lauren, what was your overall impression of the witness and the believability?
All the witnesses were believable. There weren't that many inconsistencies in what I saw. A lot of them were testifying about completely different events, though. There weren't that many that overlapped, so there wasn't much room for inconsistencies. But there wasn't anything that... There was a lot of mentions of them being a normal family, of them being strict parents, but normal family. And they talked about the different arguments that they had. And so it seemed like they had a really rocky relationship, but nothing ever pointed to the accusation that the alleged victim made. There was nothing inappropriate about their interactions. They had fights, and that was the extent of what was testified to.
So your overall impression, I mean, do you weigh a guess as to whether or not he should have been found innocent or guilty?
I think that going into this, I was skeptical just because of the charges, and because I do think it's a very real thing for people to be sworn to secrecy or feel like they've got pressure against them. But from the selection of witnesses that I read from, there wasn't anything that supported the accusation. So, from what I read, I'm not sure if I'm ready to give a decision, but there wasn't any supporting evidence in the testimonies I read.
Kelsey?
Yeah, I'm aware I've only read 4 witnesses out of 20 volumes of all this evidence, and I was very skeptical going into it as well, just because of the nature of the charges and how many there are. But from what I read, it does blow my mind a little bit that he was convicted because of what the evidence is, and especially now knowing that he is going to have an evidentiary hearing and possibly be acquitted of these charges. He definitely deserves to have that, because I know that there's new evidence coming out as well, and that the evidence that was used to convict him is questionable at best. So I definitely have an open mind, but I'm leaning more towards the fact that he would be innocent of these charges.
Penelope?
I would also think I'm also leaning towards innocent, because what caught my eye when I was reading all of these testimonies is that the prosecution got away with a lot, and the prosecution also objected to a lot of the defenses. Some of the volumes that I've read were kind of hard to get through, because every other line was objection, sustained, and then when it came to the prosecution's cross-examination, he would ask questions that didn't follow the line of questioning, or they were based on personal knowledge of an event that may have happened. It wasn't that the person was there. And when the defense had objected, the court had overruled the defense, and it seemed like he favored the prosecution. So I believe that this might have been an unfair trial, and based on all of the witnesses, they all said similar things. There were a little bit of, or there were not that many discrepancies between them, and I think he deserves another trial, a fair one this time.
So I'll give a few concluding thoughts here. the first thing that I'll say is that where each of the interns started out, that's where I started out. So following his conviction, I received a call probably in August of 2009 from the family. I went out to visit them at their home. At that time, it was in Carmichael. And I listened to everything that they had to say. And my thought was, well, that's kind of interesting, but I've heard of many cases where there's sexual abuse and the wife doesn't know or is in denial, or the family's in denial, and they just don't see the outward signs. So I came about it from a skeptical perspective. The first thing that opened my eyes about this case was watching the sentencing hearing and seeing the sentence of 378 years. That was just a shock to the system. It's like, wow. There are murderers who don't get 378 years. So there was that. And then over the course of time, you'd listen to people. They had a number of rallies. You had family friends, some of the people that testified, some of the people that didn't get to testify, spoke about their stories. And there were all these stories about, they're in Monterey and they're in a crowded room, and somehow they're like shoulder to shoulder sleeping on the floor, and somehow he raped her in the middle of that. I mean, maybe that happens, but it seems a little far-fetched. There's another incident where she allegedly got raped in the bed with the wife in the bed at the same time. And you're just like, and the wife testified, I think, I don't know if you saw this, but that, she's a light sleeper, and there's no way somebody could be raped in her bed and she not wake up. So those things start to weigh on you. And then, reading the social media accounts from the jurors who basically said her testimony took a lot to swallow, and they didn't really believe her, but the pretext call is what convinced them. Well, I knew from the start that the pretext call was kind of questionable. Once they were able to actually get in there and translate it and do kind of a more definitive translation, it became very clear that he didn't say that at all. He wasn't saying that because he had sex with her after she turned 18, that it was consensual. He was saying that if things were so bad, why did you continue to live with us after you turned 18? And that's an interesting question, but it's certainly not an admission of guilt. And throughout most of the pretext call, he's denying it. And she's saying, why won't you admit it? Why won't you admit it? Why won't you admit it? And then the other piece of new evidence that I think is really compelling is the family's theory of this thing was that it was a family dispute. She ends up leaving and going back to Nepal, and then her immigration status is threatened, and she uses this as a tool to get back into the country. And what you see from the 6 sworn statements from friends of her family and family members of her family was that they said she admitted that she was not telling the truth. So put those two pieces of evidence together with everything else, and I think you have a wrongful conviction. And so that, that's a 10-year journey for me. And so one of the things that, I think the audience should understand is I really don't tell you guys, what to think. I may tell you what my opinion is, but, I don't say, well, you need to think that this is a wrongful conviction. It was more like, hey, this is my take on it, but read the testimony for yourself and tell me what you think. And so I'm not telling the interns to come to the same conclusion as I did, because for me it took a long time. And I was pretty close to the family after a while. And I still wasn't completely convinced until I read the appellate brief, and then it was just beyond any doubt in my mind that this was an innocent man, and I'm completely convinced of that. And one thing he told me when I visited him in prison is that if he were offered a deal where he could take time served in exchange for being released, he wouldn't do it. He wants to be exonerated. So that weighed heavily in my view of just kind of confirming my belief. So thank you for joining us. This has been Vanguard Court Watch Live. We'll have the third segment in this series on Ajay Dev next week. Thanks for watching.